Vladimir Putin appears to be expanding his war in Ukraine, drawing in another sovereign country's military. Is Laos the next country to bring its forces to fight in Ukraine? And just what does this have to do with China? Well, maybe everything. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is crazy because, as we've talked about, the number one person who seems to be responsible for escalating this war is, in fact, Vladimir Putin. And if you listen to a lot of right-wing commentators in the United States, they seem to be deferential to Putin in fear of escalating the war or expanding it. But the one person who doesn't seem to share those fears is Putin himself, drawing in North Korea, a state hostile to the West, pulling in China, the West's number one rival, and now drawing in the impoverished and aid-dependent country of Laos. But what exactly are the Laotians providing here? Well, the answer is initially what they call a combined unit of military engineers from the Laos People's Armed Forces into Kursk Oblast, supposedly to help with demining operations. And I actually believe this, but what I think this probably is a test balloon. What they are doing is sort of testing to see if this minor amount of support, but make no mistake, this is a military deployment to conduct military operations. And undoubtedly, if you are in Kursk Oblast conducting demining operations, the Russians are going to be demining areas where they want to move logistics, troops, and build new bases and supply depots. So this is going to be participating in combat, right? Again, an armed force in a combat zone, facilitating the military operations. It's a military assistance. It makes them valid military targets. And I think this is most significant because the Laotians, I think, have only agreed to send about 50 engineers right now. But Laos is also reportedly offering rehabilitation services to wounded Russian soldiers. This would be sort of like a quasi-aid. Likely, Laotian state hospitals will receive a big chunk of money to rehab Russian soldiers, while the Russian state can spend less on treating its veterans, right? As we've talked about, in the Russian economy, the runaway inflation has meant that the price of a Russian doctor or nurse treating a Russian service member is phenomenally high, whereas in Laos, it would be much, much cheaper, probably a fraction of the price. It's sort of the best analogy would be, for example, the U.S. military saying, listen, it's really expensive to treat these soldiers at the VA. Why don't we just send them to Mexican hospitals and pay the Mexican hospitals to treat them instead? And so I know there's at least a fair number of veterans who would take that offer. Some of those Mexican hospitals are actually nice. So but this kind of exchange, I really think, is a test balloon for Laos. Because remember, Laos has an authoritarian regime that is pretty aligned with China. And they are happy to get any kind of state support that they can get their hands on. And if they don't see a pushback from the international community, then they are likely going to expand this. Because again, as for the same reasons North Korea desires this partnership that it's established with Russia. They see Russia as a powerful ally with access to technologies and economic resources that they could only dream about. So this is, of course, we've talked about the fact that there's been dozens of countries who have allowed their citizens to be voluntarily recruited into this war effort, but providing mercenaries is a far cry from providing your own armed forces, right? It's a vast difference, right? There's tons of Ukrainian foreign volunteers, but there are zero members of the armed forces of any Western country who are actually currently fighting under orders from in Ukraine. Now, here's what I think is the significant takeaway here. Laos is a People's Democratic Republic. And I actually had to look this up because Laos is so minimally involved, just doesn't feature prominently in kind of the geopolitics that the U.S. focuses on. But it is a People's Democratic Republic, which is usually code for China. It's bordered by Myanmar, a country undergoing a pretty significant civil war with a military dictatorship in its head. And of course, China, an autocracy run by the Chinese Communist Party and specifically Xi Jinping. But what's interesting is, first off, it is unbelievably impoverished. And while it is having it has had a significant rise in GDP per capita, it still is a long way from being anything other than a developing nation. If we can see that the economy of Laos is simply not that robust. It's measured in the single billions of dollars in terms of GDP. It's 139th in the Human Development Index. Remember, there's only about 140 countries. So, and in the Global Hunger Index, Laos is the 36th hungriest nation in the world. And it is on the list of the 52 nations with the worst hunger situations. So this is, again, the country's top-down approach to economic growth and poverty alleviation is counterproductive, leading to impoverishment, jeopardizing the rights of the poor and marginalized. So again, anytime you have someone who says, we should just have a centrally planned communist-style economy, you can just point them to Laos as a case study in trying to do true top-down communist-style policymaking. Well, it is being tried, and it is failing pretty massively. But that doesn't mean that their government isn't happy to get a good deal, right? North Korea, exactly like North Korea. But what's more significant is the Laotian relationship to China, right? Because to the West, we look at an absence of human rights, a complete absence of any kind of free market activity, a centrally planned economy, and the total absence of human rights or right to criticize the government. And we keep those sort of governments at arm's length. But you know who welcomes those sort of governments to their sphere of influence is China. And we could see that their shared shared ideology of communism, again, what the Chinese practice is a hybrid system because it's unbelievably capitalist. But they have a security cooperation agreement, and within the ASEAN nations, Laos is supportive of China and actually actively works to decrease the possibility of ASEAN nations reaching a consensus to oppose Chinese territorial disputes. In fact, in 2020, Laos was one of only 53 countries that backed the Hong Kong Security Law. This is the law that allowed the Communist Party of China to essentially take over the Hong Kong democratic institutions. So it's fair to say, I think, that the Laotian government they're not quite a Chinese proxy, but they are deeply, deeply connected to the Chinese government and deeply within their sphere of influence. And it's one of the reasons why I rail so much on this channel in favor of the West and the Western way of life and against a world that is dominated by Chinese and Russian actors, because in the countries that most strongly are pulled into the Russian and Chinese orbit, they look like Laos. They look like Belarus. They're autocracies. They're failing economies. They rely on a system of patronage in which Laotian elites receive the largest and the lion's share of the state coffers in order to bribe these politically powerful people to remain loyal to the state. But in exchange, of course, when you do that, there's nothing left over for the average Laotian. And whatever criticisms you want to levy against Western governments, there's certainly much to criticize. They don't come close to the political environment of these kind of countries. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of people go, well, why is he so worked up about the West this and the West that? It's because the alternative is so much worse, flawed though the Western way of governance may be. Now, before we talk about the power behind this kind of operation, China, I wanted to mention, of course, guys, two things. The first of which, as always, is that we are so very close to reaching $100,000 raised for the Ukrainian units who have reached out to us directly saying, listen, the fiber optic drone situation at the front is critical. We need the resources to give ourselves the best chance against these advanced Russian drones. And when the Ukrainian units know that when the need is critical, the community of the Combat Vet Reacts, those of you that view this channel, you guys show up, right? And this is eminently true. Just to be able to get this close to this $100,000 mark is incredible, right? We're buying them, of course, long-range reconnaissance fiber optic drones to let them literally follow the Russian drones back to their point of origin and find the teams that operate them. They are going to, we're going to get the mobility gear so they spend less time exposed in the open where the drones can detect them. And of course, a ton of camouflage nets that can entangle the drones before they reach their target. So if you want to help these guys out, of course, the 59th has said, listen, we'll put up some patches in recognition of the support you donors give to the 59th and a bunch of other rewards. A huge thank you to everybody that's dropped in, right? These are just the people that posted on the wall. Shout out to guys like Robert dropping 10 pounds. Right. Thanks for your continued commitment to reporting on Ukraine. Thanks to Ukraine Aid Ops for the work you do. And thanks, of course, to the defenders of Ukraine. Anon just dropping $260, just throwing down his cash and walking away. Alpha male move if there ever was one. Manuel, when the drones fly low, may they glide like a breeze over Paul's aerodynamic brilliance. Truly, a shaved head joke never gets old. All you guys, Sweden, right? Soren, another Paul, absolutely badass. So a huge thank you to everybody, including Sam Campbell. I think is this a grand? Wow. Well, truly, these guys out here honoring Independence Day with phenomenal donations. You guys are the ones who really show what Americans are really about, right? Anyone who's fighting for their freedom anywhere is a friend to the United States, right? Or at least to its people. So also, by the way, guys, it's still 4th of July weekend. And if you are someone who enjoys Strike Gum, FYI, guys, promo code LetFreedomRing, additional 20% off your order. Do not let this sleep. You guys know that we don't do that many sales. And so, but of course, we're going to do a sale for 4th of July. So if you're looking to reorder, if you're looking to stock up on the best energy drink alternative, period, zero sugar, made in the USA, veteran owned, you know, when I launched Strike Gum, I was committed to doing it right. And I get emails from dozens of you guys, and please leave us more emails, right, on strikegum.com. We'd love more reviews. We'd love to hear about who you are and what you use Strike Gum for, right? We've heard pilots who use it to today, locked in on long flights, cops who look to hit the gym after a long shift and need to lock in, new dads, hobbyist tennis players, even Ukrainian drone pilots have reached out and said, yo, this stuff is great. Because obviously when you're wearing the goggles, you can't drink an energy drink, but you can chew the gum and go at it. So thank you guys. And of course, take advantage of the 4th of July sale. All right. China. Now, let's talk about China. China reportedly has gone to the EU and said, quote, we can't afford to see Russia lose the Ukraine war, right? And this is weird because China says we can't afford to see Russia lose the war in Ukraine. This according to Beijing's foreign minister telling European officials, which is really bizarre and suspicious because normally China is extremely cagey about their intentions, about their geopolitical situation. Wang Yi said Beijing does not want to see a Russian loss because they say because it fears the United States would then shift its focus onto China. The comments were made during a 4-hour meeting between Mr. Wang and Kaja Kallas, the vice president of the European Commission, according to several sources who spoke to the South China Morning Post. Worth noting, the South China Morning Post is a Chinese propaganda outlet, right? They are quasi-state media, sort of like the Chinese version of RT. So you should take this reporting with a little bit of grain of salt, right? Again, RT can be useful in understanding the Russian propaganda machine's spin of a series of events or the narrative they are trying to create. You can see the first draft sort of the Russian propaganda narrative. And so you can see in South China Morning Post likely the sort of Chineseification or Beijing's preferred interpretation of events. Now, these remarks took many by surprise because Chinese officials do not usually speak this candidly, even in closed-door meetings. Of course, according to those familiar with the conversation, Mr. Wang also gave Ms. Callas, quote, several history lessons and lectures as though you'd become the chief of mission for the European Union or European Commission without knowing about realpolitik and the history of China. Truly, but that's okay. That's okay. We all do that sometimes. But he talked about realpolitik and concerns that Beijing that Washington will gradually turn its attention eastward. And there are signs this change is already underway. This is what's weird, right? The DOD the American DoD has been explicit that they view China as the primary threat to the Western world, to their way of life. And the U.S. is currently allocating resources in a way that directly reflects that, right? China, of course, has said up to this point that it's, quote, not a party to Russia's war against Ukraine and has denied supplying weapons to Moscow, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, right? And we're going to take a look at some of that evidence here. And the Chinese state media said that China has, quote, consistently advocated for peace talks to solve the Ukraine crisis, which is untrue. They have sort of floated peace talks that are clearly meant to be covers for Russian quasi-total victory. But again, I think it's taken a little bit by most Western analysts to be sort of a cover for Russia, or at least an act. But the fact is that this whole explanation makes no sense. Why? Because again, the White House itself has said we put American interests first. They've been explicit. They view China as the primary threat to the globe. And so, in all likelihood, this idea that somehow the United States is focusing significant portions of its defense spending and effort on the Russia-Ukraine conflict doesn't really make any sense. Because as we've talked about on this channel, when you look at the math, the U.S. spends about $900 billion on defending itself, the Department of Defense, every single year. There's actually the total defense spending is even more than that because the Department of Energy handles a lot of the U.S. nuclear arsenal infrastructure. So the actual number is probably close to $1 trillion of defense spending. And of that trillion, the equivalent of about 2 to 3% goes to funding the Ukrainian armed forces, right? The majority of aid right now is provided by the EU, and the U.S. Generally over the last year has been focused on key things that the EU simply cannot match. For example, Patriot missile batteries, as well as some other sophisticated weapons and strike systems. And this sort of mentality, this reflects, I think, a full understanding, actually a great deal for the United States, because for every dollar we spend on national defense, 3 cents of that goes to supporting Ukraine. And in exchange for that 3 cent per dollar investment, the entirety of the Russian military is pinned in place in Ukraine. And I think the real reason why China wants to see I don't know if China even cares necessarily if Russia wins or loses. That's kind of my thesis. Because if China wins, or excuse me, if Russia wins for China, they get to sort of collect on the debt that Russia owes them, right? They supported Russia through the war, as we've talked about, right? China is explicitly working with Russia to make strike drones in Ukraine. NATO explicitly saying that China is not a neutral player. And again, you can see that the Chinese are manufacturing their own versions of the Shahed drone, but they're also providing, again, non-lethal aid like microchips and tools for tank making. We've talked about this. China is extensively providing Russia with extremely high or highly sophisticated non-lethal aid, or the best way to think of it is requisite parts. So for example, China might sell Russia, they won't sell Russia an attack drone, but they will sell Russia a commercial drone, a fiber optic recording kit, and a small camera. And it's up to Russia to combine those things into a weapon system. Similarly, right, Russia says, listen, we can build 85% of the stuff for our tanks, but to get their most sophisticated systems, we need some microchips, we need some IT hardware. And so China goes, listen, I can sell you IT hardware all day. And if you choose to program those microchips, for example, to be a control station for a tank. Who are we to stop you? So that has been China's MO, right? They've also worked tirelessly to facilitate Russian trade. This is something that, while not technically a sanctions violation, or at least no Western country is willing to say, yes, China is violating sanctions, they have critically enabled Russia to continue and remain connected to the international trade system. A lot of sanctioned goods are actually purchased abroad, sold in China, and then China then sells them to Russia at a massive markup. So, again, NATO coming out and saying, quote, here at NATO, we're making sure that we can expose the fact that China is no longer a neutral player, right? Rifle sights, equipment to produce tanks, and reportedly, even Chinese spy satellites are sending images to Russia. So this is looking more and more like a proxy war in some ways between the U.S. and China. This is one of the things that I've said extensively on this channel, that World War III is here. The battle lines are drawn. The question is the West going to win? Or even are they only going to realize they're in a global conflict until when it's too late? In fact, if you want even more, here is literally a Ukrainian news outlet reporting that the place of manufacture of a drone, of a electronic component within a Russian drone, is literally shows you ECOD Precision Manufacturing Company Limited in China. There it is. There's this drone part stamped saying, yep, Shahed drone made in China, baby. So the fact is that a Russia that wins is going to both have an economic debt to China, but it's also going to have proven a military playbook to beat the West. That includes drawing the conflict out on an unbelievably long time frame, relying on mass infantry assaults to prevent Western expensive but devastating weapons from taking out any critical piece of infrastructure, and the reliance on cheap commercializable drone technology like fiber optic drones to sort of circumvent Western weapons and tactics. And for China, they'll say, great, you've written a playbook, you owe us, so that when we invade Taiwan and get sanctioned, we already have a network of trading partners that we trade with outside of the U.S. system. We already have a military alliance between us, North Korea, and Russia, who can assist each other in developing the tactics and techniques to beat the West and Western allies. And we know that the West is currently will be exhausted of this war fighting. Again, they say, okay, about 4 years, you'll start to see Western support sort of lose its political will. And for China, who thinks in 100-year increments, a 4-year conflict is nothing. It's their version of bombing Iran's nuclear sites. You do it in an afternoon, you take a victory lap, and you go home. So a victorious Russia would be great, but a defeated Russia would also work just fine for China, because a defeated Russia would still have to accept that level of defeat. Sanctions would likely be lifted on a defeated Russia, and China would be able to exploit this militarily, politically, and economically devastated partner, right? The irony is, of course, that Russia itself, the reason Russian oligarchs took over Russia is because the post-Soviet Russian economy was absolutely obliterated, and valuable assets were for sale for an incredibly low price. So China may actually be able to come into a defeated Russia and say, we'll buy up your mines. We'll make an investment in your mining operations. We'll make an investment in your oil operations. We'll make an investment in your manufacturing capabilities. You will make an investment in your military manufacturing capabilities. And suddenly the Chinese will be able to worm their way deep into the Russian economy. And being able to dig into another industrialized nation is something that China immensely desires, right? Again, look at their desire of Taiwan, right? It's not just political, it's economic. Taiwan is a very economically productive island, but it is still a fraction of its economic productivity is a fraction of that of Russia. And so a defeated Russia would be great for China. A victorious Russia would be even better. So I treat this one a little bit like the old China's final warning, right? This is a truism in Russian that is an idiom, right? That means that literally refers to a warning that carries no real consequences. And this is the This is basically the Chinese version of constantly claiming that they are making bombastic threats, saying that this is unacceptable. China can never accept this. China can never accept that. This is just sort of the bluster and posturing of the Chinese government. But the problem is, given that the Chinese government, literally every year, there's some new thing that is unacceptable to China and an affront to the very fundamental values of Chinese sovereignty or whatever. When that happens every year, and then China doesn't do anything about it, and it's been happening every time. For example, one parody citizens would often add numbers to the phrase added for humorous effects, such as the 231st final Chinese warning, the 850th final Chinese warning. They point out, right, the term was also popularized in English language social media when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, referring to China's repeated threats, which were said to be superficially strong. But what has China done after Pelosi's visit to Taiwan? Fuck all. It's done nothing. Right. So I would take this with a grain of salt. I think this is just China trying out a new diplomatic strategy of sort of being fake candid with EU diplomats and also kind of threatening them, right? Kind of saying, listen, we'll never allow, we're a huge economy. We can manufacture a gajillion things. And if you don't let Russia win, again, our preferred outcome, we're going to be mad and introduce consequences. But what consequences can the Chinese ailing economy and China with its ailing and aging population, how much can they introduce? Some short-term pain for sure, but it's unlikely you're going to see like the Chinese military marching towards Kiev. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Huge thank you to our Colonel tier members, folks like James, J21, Yanko, Georgiev, Chris Gorsuch, Paul Templeton, Cytronic, Steve Moran, TR Need, Alan Knutson, CM Holmes, all of our Lieutenant tier members. You guys are the ones who make this whole thing possible. I appreciate you so much, and I hope you enjoyed the video on Thursday. It was absolutely pretty sick. See ya. Cheers.